What does it mean to bear witness? Award-winning photojournalist Greg Locke takes us from the Berlin Wall to Sarajevo and beyond. Welcome to Tales Under the Cat Tree. I'm your host, Dupes, and these are tales by humans for humans. After all, words and stories are what give meaning to the worlds we live in. Everyone remembers where they were during certain moments in history. If you were born in the last 50 years, I could ask you a series of questions like, where were you when the Challenger exploded? Where were you when the Berlin Wall fell? Do you remember when Nelson Mandela walked free? Where were you when the Twin Towers came down? Or when the 2004 tsunami struck? Or when the world locked down for COVID? We walk through life as one among a multitude. We all experience personal life-altering events, but rarely do we have a front seat to world-altering events. For most of us, the news happens somewhere else. But why do some events stay in your reality so deeply that you remember the exact moment you heard the news? Why do some events pull you out of your chair and force you to act? For the past century, brave individuals armed with nothing more than a camera have been sent to the darkest places of human misery. They bear witness. They shine a light on those experiences so that we might learn, so that we might understand, and so that those who suffer aren't forgotten beneath the sands of time. Greg Locke is one of those people. Greg is a veteran journalist with 4 decades of experience covering international affairs, conflict, and politics. His work has been featured in major publications including The Globe and Mail, Toronto Sun, Reuters, and Time magazine, and won numerous awards. He has spent extensive time documenting crises around the world from Africa to the Americas and was the first photographer to be awarded the Fellowship for Journalism in the area of Foreign Affairs and International Development by the Canadian Association of Journalists and the Canadian International Development Agency. Greg also happens to hail from my hometown of St. John's, Newfoundland, and it is, therefore, my absolute pleasure to have Greg on the show today.
My name is Greg Locke. I'm a photojournalist, and I have 40 years of experience covering news, mostly crime, business, politics, war. At some point, those things all have an intersecting point. I have worked for the Globe and Mail, Toronto Sun, Reuters, Time magazine. Started working in my teens at the Muse in St. John's, Newfoundland. Kind of went on from there. So I've covered international affairs, a lot of time in Africa. I've done a number of trips to Africa, and I seem to going back there, and it's always very fascinating for me. It's one of those things that just, one door leads to another door leads to another door. The Muse led to the Herald led to UPI. UPI brought me to Toronto. When they closed up, I went to work for the Toronto Sun, and I kind of got tired of daily newspaper grind, went off and then started working for news magazines. It was just serendipity more than anything else. It was serendipity and the joy just to go explore the world.
What do you think sets a great photojournalist apart from an average photojournalist?
There's such a scale. There's the guy who works for the daily newspaper who goes out there and grinds it out every day looking for something new and interesting to photograph or to show his readers. And that's hard. That's probably one of the hardest things there is to do. But on the whole, I think the best are the ones who put the viewer there. I don't want me or my camera to get into the way of the relationship between the viewer and my subject. I want you to feel like you're sitting where I'm sitting and seeing what I'm sitting, but not filtered through my vision. I think the best photojournalists do that. They connect the viewer with the scene and the humanity in particular, and just kind of get out of the way. Don't, make your art, because photos are art and journalism is applied art. You're using the rules of art to communicate a story. All storytellers do that, but you don't want that to be seen. A designer would tell you the best designs, you will never see the hand of the designer. That's kind of where I approach it.
A mutual friend of ours told me about how you had been at the Berlin Wall when the wall came down and were doing the photography there. And it struck me What a fascinating life to have borne witness to some of the most amazing events. We could start at the Berlin Wall, or we could start at any other event.
Sure, Berlin is absolutely fine because it was a big turning point for me. It was chaotic. It was pretty crazy. The night we arrived that day, like late in the afternoon, and that night was literally when the gate, I think was Friedrichstrasse. It's so long ago. I think it was the Friedrichstrasse gate at near the Brandenburg Gate crossing that opened that night, and that's where most of those big famous photos came from. We just dumped our stuff in the hotel and went out, and we were out all night long. It was crazy. There was people there. I went over to the East Berlin side and started photographing over there. It was surreal. You don't when you're young and full of adrenaline, you don't really think a whole lot, and you just do. You just it's head down and go. And a lot of your memories of it actually are the photos you take. But lots of people, lots of people at the wall. It was a big party atmosphere. There was these side things going on, which kind of surprised me, which were actually protests of different sorts. So I saw the West German police breaking up protests, and we went over to East Berlin, and there was a huge protest. I think it was my German wasn't that great, and, despite some of the German professors at university doing their best to teach. It was the East German Communist Party and the Socialist Students Party on the other side of the wall seemed to be protesting the wall coming down. I met, and I've heard he's still a politician in Germany. He was the head of I think it was one of the Communist Party youth wings, named Gregor Gysi. He was a young man then, but he was there, and I photographed him, and something told me that this guy was going to be famous. And sure enough, I'm told he is still the oldest serving member in the German parliament today.
So you show up in Berlin, you're there for 6 weeks. The night you're there, the gates open up and you're crossing between West Germany and East Germany. People are protesting. What did you find over the next few weeks as events moved on? And what did you do?
Well, for the first week or two, the first week was very celebratory. I mean, it was street parties really around that area. And even, if you go into some of the other neighborhoods like Kreuzberg and Charlottenburg, where, a lot of Turkish immigrants are, it was very interesting in that it was a big party. I think there was a lot of people who were thinking, this may not end well, or, there's going to be a lot of problems to come. But for the most part, it was a big party. And then the politicians, I think the politicians were trying to catch up with the events of history very much. And about 2 weeks in, I remember gathering under the Brandenburg Gate, and at the time, I think it was Helmut Kohl and Erich Honecker from East Germany, and a bunch of other people were there, and they did, this kind of ceremonial thing to try to catch up to the previous 2 weeks events when they realized that, there's no going back now. I think a lot of people thought there was going to be a big crackdown from the Soviets or the East Germans, but it didn't happen. I have a picture of, East German border guards being very smiling for the cameras and everything, which, when I shot the picture, I figured I was going to get pummeled, but, that's not what happened. So
Did people come up to you and ask you where you were from, what were you doing, or even tell you their stories or anything of that nature as you were doing all of these things?
there was some of that, but for the most part, I've always believed that as a photojournalist, I try to blend in. I don't try to stand out. So I kind of move and try to be as discreet as possible. I make my pictures, but some people I talk to and they're saying, "Oh, this is so wonderful," and they were wrapped up in the moment, also very much so. One of the things that also came after was, and this had to be explained to me because I didn't know the whole social dynamic between the East Berliners and the West Berliners, particularly even beyond East Germany, West Germany, how those people were related. And that Christmas, I was with a reporter who was doing a story for the Globe and Mail. We went out to visit this family, and he was having his family from East Berlin over for Christmas dinner, and they hadn't seen each other in 20 years, 30 years, something like that. So that was kind of interesting.
What are the stories that have moved you the most in all of the travels and the photojournalism that you've done?
Yeah, the big one, it's just an endless dream. Sarajevo was huge, and Bosnia in general. I did a long time there, in and out. Basically, the 90s, I call Greg's lost years, was a brutal, civil war. The savagery was amazing. The worst in Europe since World War II, only to be surpassed by the Ukraine recently. For me, the research was really hard there because you had so much history to wade through to understand the different factions, the different sides, how they came together in Yugoslavia, why they broke up. You're going back 1,000 years in history to understand that. You got to go back to the Ottoman Empire and their invasion of the Balkans to understand what caused the war in the Balkans. I took the Canadian military up on an offer to go hang out with them at their camp, and they were going on a patrol. It was in the spring, and they were going up in this valley where just before the winter, there was a major battle. It ended, but the snowfall, and this is up in the mountains, the heavy, heavy snowfalls. And now the snow was melting, so people were going back up into the mountains and recovering the bodies and cleaning up, in the spring when the snow melted. And then the next day we went out and we visited a village, and just pure happenstance, we met this woman who was just told that they had found the body of her son up in the valley that we were in the day before. So we were with her. I had seen her son's body, and then we meet the woman and the chaplain, the people whose job it was to go to these villages and tell people these things.
And that must have been really tough to even record that on film. I can't imagine what she must have been going through.
Yeah, she was in this little bombed out house of hers. And if you look at the picture, it could be the 1900s. Some of her friends were there and they're hugging and crying. Everyone's sitting around with their head down. I go, you just got to take the picture, Greg. Just take the damn picture. That's all you got to do. And you just do it. And for the most part, nobody notices. Sometimes in those situations, people want you to take the picture. That's the other thing I find. In North America, in that situation, people get angry at you and say, oh, you're taking advantage of someone's grief. I find working in places like that is they want you to take the picture because they want that recorded for history, and they want you to tell other people about their misery and the war.
Why is it so important that there is someone to bear witness?
Well, that's a good question, because more than once you ask yourself that. You go, why am I bothering with this? Who cares? And I remember being in Ottawa. I had just gotten back from El Salvador, and it was brutal. Literally had someone say, why do you do that? That's such filthy work. How do you even respond to that? Like, I remember in Yugoslavia when there was a woman's child. This child was only 1 or 2 years old. This village had been bombed, and a bunch of us went out. Journalists travel in packs, but it was still a pack. And we went there, and a lot of people, we were all feeling really, really bad. But she said, no, take the pictures. You have to take these pictures. And that's always stuck with me and that comes from, that reinforces the concept of bearing witness as a journalist and a photographer. It's your job to take the pictures. I can't help her. I can't stop the war. I can't bring her child back. I can't even treat her wounds. That's somebody else's job. But my job is to record this and tell other people about it so that the world doesn't really forget.
You talked about how you've been backwards and forwards to Africa and seen different parts of Africa, I assume. Where in Africa have you actually gone for different things?
Mostly East Africa and Central Africa. So the Rwanda, the first one I went, it was actually to work with Elliot Layton on a book project about MSF and international aid. At the same time, Somalia was still basically a lawless place, was run by warlords. And I went up and visited the border region up there. There were 3 refugee camps that were the biggest refugee camps in the world. And I watched a news report the other day, and they were still there. And then into South Sudan to cover the conflict there. What it did was it opened up a whole lot of other stories that I wanted to cover, and I knew that I would be back. And then a few years later, I ended up getting a fellowship with the Canadian International Development Agency for journalists working foreign affairs and international stuff like that, which was cool because I was the first photographer who had ever gotten it. It's gone to writers. So I went back, and the objective was to do a major project about malaria. I started doing that, but I got so distracted that I met another great journalist over there, and I kind of passed all my stuff off to her, and she did write an amazing award-winning book about malaria. I ended up in northern Uganda along the South Sudan border working on basically the story that's the remnants of the Lord's Resistance Army, which had at the time, again, from a historical perspective, had been the longest running, I don't know how much of a war it was, but conflict in the world.
How does it feel sometimes that, you said, some of these warlords camps were still there, like even after, 20, 30 years, some of the places you've covered haven't recovered?
I'm actually surprised. Nothing surprises me anymore, but I'm surprised that things that, were set up as temporary aid missions, nothing's changed. I think what happens is that in this case, particularly Somalia, it was such a devastating, destructive war and it dispersed so many people that there was no going back. I think once they were out of the country and they stayed there so long that basically these places became, new villages, new towns. And so I think that's how that works. In northern Uganda, there was a whole bunch, they call them displaced people's camps, but they became villages because they'd been there for so long and stopped being temporary and became permanent villages.
Top 3 times that you felt unsafe during doing what you did?
By far, number 1 was one night in Sarajevo. I found myself out after curfew, and we were out, and I came upon this guy with a battered old Fiat through broken German and sign language. It was he was some sort of a taxi driver, and he would take us back to our hotel for 5 Deutschmarks. Cool. And we got in his car, and this man was not well. He was obviously shell shocked. He was in the far advanced stages of trauma. I kind of lost track, couldn't understand what he was saying. But we pulled up to this checkpoint. The classic bad scene from the movie where there's oil drums burning and guys with guns, and I went, "We're dead. This is it." And I said to the young guy from the Winnipeg Free Press, I said, "If this gets bad, you just run as far and fast as you can." The guy said, "Oh, I'm just picking up my girlfriend or something." I understood that much anyway, right? And I went, "Oh no." And sure enough, this young woman comes running out of this gas station where the checkpoint was and hops in the car and off we go. And he takes us to our hotel with no problem. But that was the one point that I thought, yeah, this is it. This is where it ends right here. When I was in Rwanda, I had to cross into Zaire, or then it was Zaire, and it was just Congo, and cross the border, and there was no border. How do you get a visa from the government of Zaire when the government of Zaire doesn't even control that border post? So you never know who's going to board it. These are the funny stories. I ended up trading basically a bottle of herbal essence shampoo to the guy with the machine gun to get a border stamp to get into Zaire. Because it was his day to control the border. And, it was just weird.
Top 3 photos that you've taken.
One is it's in Goma, Zaire, Congo, which is right on the border with Rwanda. There was a battle in a refugee camp, and we were trying to get to that refugee camp, but the roads were blocked. There was 800,000 people on the road. It was just miles and miles and miles of people, and we couldn't get down the road. So I hopped out of the car and I took to the ditch, the field beside, which was really dumb because there's landmines around, but you don't think of that at the time. And I have a picture of a stream of refugees going across the horizon with a volcano, the Virunga Mountains in the background. And that's one of my favorite shots because, see, the thing is about having your favorite shots is that you're emotionally attached to it. There's 2 things, right? It's either I'm emotionally attached to this picture, but it's not necessarily the best picture for the story. But in this case, it was the best picture for the story because it really conveyed, the humanity on the road. It was biblical, is what it looked like, and to me, and felt like a biblical exodus of humans.
Next time, let's have you come on the show and we can discuss some of your photos, some specific photos and some of the stories behind it. Thank you very much for coming on the show, Greg.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks to Greg Locke for taking time out of his busy schedule to come on the show. Thank you for listening to another episode of Tales Under the Cat Tree. Listen to the archives wherever you get your podcast or at tales.dupes.ca. That's tales.dups.ca. This podcast is about the worlds we create, the realities we conjure, and the wonders of the human condition. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please help me reach more people by subscribing or sharing this episode. This podcast, including its intro music, is produced, edited, and created by Dileepa Wijewardena. Give your pets a cuddle until we meet again for some tales under the cat tree.
I swear to God, if I wrote this, people swear I made it up.